At the age of 18, a young woman receives a call that brings her world to a halt. On the other end of the line, a trembling voice says, "I'm your mother, but not the one who created you." Suddenly, all the questions she's avoided her entire life take on new weight, and a secret buried nearly 2 decades ago threatens to surface. What this woman had to confess was something that no one, not even her own daughters, were prepared to hear. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on an ordinary Thursday, tearing through the silence of the night like a cry straight from the past. Margaret was in the kitchen, finishing drying her last cup of tea when the phone rang. She looked at the screen, an unknown number. For a moment he considered not answering, but something at that moment, a strange sensation deep in her stomach, caused her to slide her finger across the screen. "Hello?" On the other side there was a pause, one breath, and then a voice that was at once completely strange and terribly absurdly familiar, like hearing a distorted echo of yourself, like listening to your own daughter, but different, harder, colder. "My name is Sophie." Margaret felt her legs weaken. The cup she was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor, but she didn't even notice. The whole world had been reduced to that voice on the other end of the line. "I know who you are," the girl went on, and each word was a dagger being plunged slowly into Margaret's heart. "I know what you did 18 years ago. I know you left me in that hospital like I was trash. And now I've come to get what is mine." The phone slipped out of Margaret's hand and fell to the floor, along with the shards of the cup. Her hands trembled so violently that she could barely breathe. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it echoing in her ears. 18 years since that terrible night in the hospital. 18 years carrying a secret that corroded his soul like acid. 18 years of pretending that it had never happened, that the baby she had abandoned didn't exist. And now she had returned. Margaret let herself slip down the kitchen wall until she sat on the floor, surrounded by shards of porcelain and the crushing weight of the past that had just knocked on her door. She knew with an absolute certainty that ran through every cell of her body that her life would never ever be the same. Thomas appeared at the kitchen door, alarmed by the noise. "Margaret, what happened? Are you okay?" But Margaret couldn't answer. He couldn't form words. How to explain? How to start counting? Emma ran downstairs, still dressed in the pink flannel pajamas Margaret had bought her last week. "Mom, what was that noise?" Margaret looked at her daughter, the daughter she had chosen, the daughter she had become, and felt the family guilt tighten her throat like an invisible hand. Emma was 18 now, pretty smart, about to start college. She had no idea. "I had no idea I had a sister, a twin sister. I only dropped a cup," Margaret managed to say, her voice coming out shaky and weak. "Sorry, I'm fine." "Go back to bed." Thomas helped her to her feet, holding her arms while her legs still trembled. "You're not okay," he said, worried. "You're pale. Come sit here." He guided her to a chair and Emma ran to get a glass of water. Margaret accepted, trying to look normal, trying to control her breath that came in short, desperate spasms. I think I'm tired," she mumbled. It was a long day. But when Thomas and Emma finally went upstairs back to their bedrooms, Margaret was alone in the kitchen, staring at the phone lying on the floor. The screen was still on. With her hand still shaking, she picked up the device. There was a message sent shortly after the call dropped. "See you soon, Mum. I have a lot to talk about with you. And with my sister." Margaret felt the bile rise up her throat. She ran to the sink and threw up, her entire body shaking with silent sobs. For 18 years she had convinced herself that this moment would never come, that Sophie would never find her, that the secret she had buried deep in her soul would be buried forever. But she was wrong, so wrong. And now Margaret knew there was nowhere else to run. There was no longer any way to hide. The past she had left in that Chicago public hospital 18 years ago had returned, and he wanted answers. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, each step seeming to weigh a ton. He passed by Emma's room, saw the light still burning under the door, heard the low sound of music playing. "Your daughter, your Emma." In a few hours, maybe in a few days, her world was going to fall apart completely. In the room, Thomas was already asleep. The heavy and regular breathing of someone who had no secrets, of someone who slept with a clear conscience. Margaret watched him for a moment, feeling a pang of envy. What would it be like to have this peace? What would it be like not to carry this crushing weight every day? She lay down, but she knew she wouldn't sleep. Not tonight. Maybe never again, because Margaret knew what was coming. He knew that Sophie hadn't called just to say hello, just to introduce herself. That tone in the girl's voice, that coldness, that barely contained anger. Sophie had come to destroy everything, and deep down, Margaret knew she deserved it. But to understand how we got here, how a simple phone call managed to completely destroy Margaret's carefully constructed life, we need to go back 18 years in time. Back to a cold March night, to a Chicago public hospital, to a delivery room where 2 babies had just been born and where Margaret Dawson made the most terrible decision of her life. March 2007. Margaret was 22 years old, and her world was falling apart. 3 months earlier, her husband, if you could call that irresponsible kid her husband, had left home and never returned. He simply took the things, left a scribbled note saying, "I can't do it anymore," and disappeared. No explanation, no apology, only the emptiness he left behind. And Margaret was pregnant and alone in a 1-room apartment on Chicago's South Side that barely fit herself. An apartment where heating worked when she was lucky, where cockroaches climbed the walls at night, where the upstairs neighbor hit the floor every time she made any noise. She worked as a waitress at a vagabond diner that paid minimum wage, and where the manager ran his hand over her ass whenever he passed. But she could handle it. Because I needed to. Because I had no choice. When the contractions began on a freezing Tuesday in March, Margaret was in the middle of her shift. Her water burst right there in the middle of the restaurant as she carried a tray of burgers to table 6. One of the other waitresses called an ambulance. Margaret remembers lying on the stretcher, staring at the roof of the ambulance, her hands clenching her belly, thinking, how am I going to do this? How? In the hospital, as the contractions grew stronger, more painful, more unbearable, the nurse asked the routine question, is there anyone we can call? Husband, family? Margaret closed her eyes and shook her head. No, there is no one, and it was true. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 17. She had no siblings. He had no close cousins. It was just her, alone in the world. About to have a baby, she didn't know how she would support, except it wasn't a baby. There were 2. When the doctor said, it's a girl. And then, with a surprised expression, wait, there's another one. Margaret felt as if the ground had opened up under her and she was falling into a bottomless hole. 2 babies, 2 mouths to feed, 2 children to wear, 2 lives for which she would be completely responsible. Congratulations, the doctor said, placing the 2 babies wrapped in his arms. 2 beautiful, healthy girls. Margaret looked at them, sensitive, perfect, identical, with those wrinkled red faces and the tiny puckered punjinos. And she felt panic, pure and utter panic that rose up my throat like bile. She couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All she could feel was the crushing weight of those 2 small lives in her arms and the terrible certainty that she couldn't. She just couldn't do it. The nurses took the babies to the nursery, and Margaret was alone in the room, staring at the ceiling, tears streaming silently down the corners of her eyes. How? She whispered into the void. How am I going to do that? For the next 3 days, while in the hospital, Margaret could barely look at the twins. Every time a nurse tried to put both of them on her lap at the same time, she felt that weight, that impossible responsibility, crush her like a giant rock. She held one. Just one. And even then, it seemed too much. At night, when the hospital was quiet and the lights were off, Margaret would lie awake, staring at the 2 babies sleeping side by side in the crib next to the bed. They were so small, so innocent, so completely dependent on her, and she had nothing to offer. No money, no family, no future that made sense. It was on the 3rd night that the idea came, a terrible idea, unthinkable, monstrous, but also practice necessary. The only possible solution to an impossible situation. Margaret got up from the bed, her body still sore from childbirth, and went to the crib. The 2 babies slept soundly, their little going up and down with that soft, rhythmic breathing of newborns. She reached out and touched each one. Her skin felt soft and warm. He saw how the tiny little fingers closed around his finger, when she touched the palm of his hands, and then, with tears blurring her vision, Margaret made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She chose Emma, the baby who had been born first, the baby who was a little closer to her in the crib, the baby who had a small dimple on her chin. Margaret took Emma in her arms, wrapped her in the pink hospital blanket, and looked at the other baby for the last time. Sophie. She didn't even know that the name was written on the bracelet, but she read it there. In that final moment, Sophie. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm very sorry. But I can't do it with both of them. You will have a better life this way. Some good family will adopt you. It's going to give you everything I can't give." And then she left. At 3 in the morning, while the nurses were busy with other patients, Margaret simply picked Emma up and walked off the hospital corridors. She walked past the reception with her head down, the baby hidden under her coat. No one stopped her. No one questioned it, and Sophie stayed behind. Alone in that crib, abandoned, Margaret didn't look back. She couldn't. If I looked, I knew it would completely collapse. She walked the cold streets of Chicago with Emma pressed to her chest, the icy wind slicing through her face. She got on the bus at dawn that would take her back to that miserable apartment. And throughout the journey, while Emma slept innocently in her arms, she repeated to herself like a mantra, it was the only option. She will be adopted. Some good family will get it. She's going to have a better life than I could give. It was the only option. It was the only option. But even then, even as she tried to convince herself, Margaret knew the truth. She knew she had just done something unforgivable. She knew she had abandoned one daughter to save the other. And she knew that this original sin would tarnish every moment of happiness she would have for the rest of her life. The years passed. Margaret built a life, a good life in the eyes of all. When Emma was 3, Margaret met Thomas in a coffee shop. He was a lawyer, recently hired by a corporate law firm. 8 years older than her, already established in his career with that air of stability and security that Margaret had never known. They started talking. He noticed Emma, made silly jokes that made the girl laugh, and something in that moment touched Margaret deeply. Here was a man who did not shy away from responsibility. A man who smiled at his daughter with genuine tenderness. They started dating. Thomas never asked hard questions about Emma's father. Margaret said it had been a brief marriage, that the man had left when she was pregnant, and Thomas accepted. Simple as that. He did not press for details. He did not require documents. He just accepted Margaret and Emma as a package, and Margaret fell in love with him because of it. They married when Emma was 5. Thomas legally adopted Emma, gave her his last name, and they moved into a spacious house in Naperville, a thriving suburb on the outskirts of Chicago. The house had 4 bedrooms, a large garden where Emma could play, and was on a quiet street with old trees that shaded the sidewalks. It was everything Margaret never had as a child, everything she had dreamed of being able to give her daughter. Emma grew up in a private school. Guy had piano lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays, ballet on Saturdays, friends who came to elaborate birthday parties that Margaret planned months in advance, vacations at resorts in Florida, Christmases with gifts piled under the tree. Margaret became the perfect image of the devoted mother and exemplary wife. She was a volunteer at Emma's school. He organized dinners for Thomas's colleagues. He kept the house impeccable. He smiled at the family photos that filled the walls, but the secret haunted her. On each of Emma's birthdays, Margaret thought of Sophie. Where would she be? With whom? Would you be happy? Had she been adopted by a loving family, as Margaret had desperately tried to believe? Every time she looked at Emma, Margaret also saw the daughter she had abandoned. The same green eyes, the same reddish-brown hair, the same dimple on the chin. Sometimes at night, when Thomas and Emma slept, Margaret would go down to the kitchen and weep silently, guilt devouring her like an invisible cancer. She had saved one daughter by condemning the other, and no matter how many years passed, no matter how perfect his life seemed, that fact never changed. Margaret never told Thomas about Sophie. I couldn't. How to explain? How could you tell the man who loved her, the man who had adopted Emma as his own daughter, that there was another child? A child she just left behind. She convinced herself that it was better this way, that the past should stay in the past, that Sophie was fine somewhere living her own life. But deep down, Margaret knew the truth. He knew he was just running away. I knew that one day somehow that secret would come to light. She just didn't imagine it would be like this. I didn't imagine it would be through a phone call at 11:47 p.m. on an ordinary Thursday. Meanwhile, Sophie's life had been completely different. Sophie spent the first few days in the hospital being cared for by nurses who looked at her with pity. "Poor thing," they whispered to each other. The mother only took the other. He just abandoned this one. At 5 days old, Sophie was transferred to a temporary home. Then another, and another. The adoption system was overloaded. Babies were easier to place, yes, but twins separated had a complicated history. And Sophie, for some reason no one could quite explain, never found a permanent family. She went through 7 different homes before she turned 5. Some families were kind but temporary, expecting their own biological children. The others were cold, more interested in the government check than in the child itself. Sophie grew up knowing she was different, knowing that there was something wrong with her. Why else no one really wanted her? Why was it always returned as a defective product? At the age of 8, in a particularly difficult home where her adoptive mother yelled more than she spoke, Sophie began to ask questions. He asked the social worker about his biological parents. Who were they? Why did they leave her? The social worker, a tired woman named Gloria, who had seen many children pass through her hands, hesitated. But Sophie had that look of someone who needed to know, who deserved to know. "You had a sister," Gloria said finally. "A twin sister. Your mother took her and left you." Sophie felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. A sister, a twin sister, and her mother had chosen her. Not Sophie, the other. "Why?" Sophie asked, tears already streaming down her face. "Why didn't she want me?" Gloria had no answer. How to have it? How to explain to an 8-year-old child that sometimes people make impossible choices? That sometimes love is not enough? That day changed Sophie forever. The pain of being abandoned turned into something darker. Anger, resentment, a burning need to understand. She spent the next few years obsessed. Every temporary home, every new school, Sophie carried with her the story of her missing sister. The sister who was chosen. The sister who had the life that Sophie should have had. At 16, Sophie was in her 13th foster home. She had become a difficult teenager, closed, suspicious, with that look that clearly said, "Don't get too close because I know you're going to abandon me anyway." It was in this home, with a family that at least tried, that Sophie found something in the old files that the social worker had left. Birth documents, names: Margaret Dawson, Emma Dawson, your mother, your sister. Sophie stared at those names for hours, repeating them out loud, memorizing each letter. And at that moment, Sophie made a decision. She would find them. She would make Margaret Dawson look into the eyes of the daughter she abandoned. She would meet Emma Dawson, the sister who stole her life, and she would do justice. Sophie got to work. He took 2 part-time jobs, one at a coffee shop, the other cleaning offices at night. Every penny she earned, she saved. He saved for months until he had enough money to hire a cheap private investigator. It took the investigator 3 weeks to find Margaret. She had married, changed her name to Margaret Sullivan, and lived in Naperville with her lawyer husband and daughter, the daughter Emma. Sophie looked at the photos the investigator gave her. Photos of Margaret leaving a beautiful house in the suburbs. Photos of Emma smiling, carrying books, getting into a new car. And Sophie felt her anger burn even harder. As she went from home to home, rejected and invisible, Emma had it all. A house, a family, a mother, their mother. Sophie waited, planned. And when she finally turned 18, when she was finally free from the system that had imprisoned her all her life, she picked up the phone, and he made the call that would change everything. 3 days after the call, Sophie showed up at the door of the Sullivan mansion during Emma's birthday dinner. It was a Saturday night. The house was filled with lights, soft music playing over the sound system, the smell of homemade lasagna wafting through the kitchen. Emma had invited some friends to celebrate her 18th birthday. They were in the room laughing, taking pictures, living that perfect moment of youth that seemed to last forever. Margaret was in the kitchen, putting candles on the chocolate cake she had spent all afternoon decorating. Thomas opened a bottle of wine, smiling at her. completely oblivious to the storm that was about to come crashing down on their lives. "The doorbell rang, I answer," Margaret said. Wiping her hands on her apron, she walked across the hallway, still smiling, still living in that bubble of unconscious happiness. He opened the door, and he saw his own face staring back at her. The world stopped. Sophie was standing there on the doorstep, wearing a worn sweatshirt and ripped jeans. But it wasn't the clothes that left Margaret paralyzed. It was the face. That face that was precisely identically the same as Emma's. The same green eyes. The same reddish-brown hair tied in a ponytail. The same dimple on the chin. The same bone structure. The same freckles spread across his nose. It was like looking at Emma. But it wasn't Emma. "Hi, Mom," Sophie said, and her voice was full of poison. "Do you miss me?" Margaret couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. His hands grabbed the doorframe, his legs threatening to give way. Emma, hearing voices, came to the entrance. She appeared next to Margaret, still laughing at something a friend had said, and stopped completely. The smile died on his lips. She looked at Sophie. Sophie looked back. It was like looking in a mirror. Who are you?" Emma asked, her voice coming out trembling and confused. Sophie took a step into the house, gently pushing Margaret aside. Margaret did not resist. I couldn't. She was completely frozen in shock. "I'm your sister," Sophie said, her eyes fixed on Emma. "The sister our mother threw away." Emma looked from Sophie to Margaret, tears already beginning to form in her eyes. "Mom, what is she talking about?" "What sister? I don't have any sisters." Thomas appeared from the kitchen holding the wine, completely lost. "What's happening here? Who are you?" Sophie turned to him, a bitter smile on her lips. "I'm Sophie, Margaret's other daughter. The daughter she left in a hospital 18 years ago to die in the system." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's friends appeared at the entrance of the room, curious but immediately realizing that something was very, very wrong. One of them mumbled something about having to leave, and within minutes they were all gone, leaving only her family, or what was left of her. Thomas looked at Margaret, his expression changing from confusion to horror. "Margaret? Is that true?" Margaret finally found her voice, but she came out broken, desperate. "Thomas, I can explain. Please let me explain." "Explain?" Sophie screamed, and all the anger she had kept for 18 years finally exploded. "Explain what? How did you abandon me? How did you choose her and let me rot in foster care my whole life?" Emma was crying now, her hands covering her mouth, her body shaking. "Mom, please say that's not true, please." But Margaret couldn't lie. No more, not with Sophie there, living proof of his sin. She let herself fall to the floor, the sobs shaking her entire body. "I'm sorry," she cried. I'm sorry. Sophie took a backpack off her back and started throwing documents on the floor. Birth certificates, hospital records, photos of temporary homes, an entire timeline of abandonment and rejection. 18 years, Sophie said, her voice breaking. 18 years I spent wondering what was wrong with me. Because no one wanted me, because I was always the one who was left. Thomas picked up one of the documents, his hands shaking. "Read." He read it again, and then he looked at Margaret as if he were seeing a stranger. "Did you have twins? You had 2 daughters and never told me?" Emma was sitting on the floor now, hugging her knees, looking from Sophie to Margaret, trying to process the impossible. "I have a sister," she whispered. "I have a twin sister and I never knew." Sophie knelt in front of Emma, and for the first time since she arrived, her voice became softer. "You had it all," she said. "This house, this family, that life, while I had nothing. Nothing but rejection after rejection." Emma held out her hand hesitantly and touched Sophie's face. It was like touching your own reflection. "I didn't know," Emma cried. "I swear I didn't know." Margaret watched the two of them, guilt destroying her inside. Seeing their daughters together for the first time in 18 years should be a joyful moment. But all she felt was the devastating pain of what she had done. Thomas helped Margaret to her feet, but her touch was cold, distant. "How could you?" he asked, his voice low but full of pain. "How could you do that and never tell me?" "I was 22, Margaret said desperately. "I had no money, no family, nothing. I couldn't take care of 2 babies. I thought she would be adopted, that he would have a better life." "Lie!" Sophie screamed, standing up. "You didn't think about me for a second. You only thought about yourself. How much easier it would be with just one. You discarded me like garbage." Margaret had no way to argue, because Sophie was right. In that terrible moment in the hospital, Margaret had thought only of herself, in its survival, in his ability to cope. Emma got up and surprisingly went to Sophie. She held the hands of the sister she had never met. "I don't know what to say," Emma whispered. "I don't know how to fix it, but I want to meet you. I want you to stay." Sophie looked at Emma, and for a moment the anger in her eyes softened. Here was someone innocent in all of this. Someone who, like her, was a victim of Margaret's choices. "I didn't come here for you," Sophie said, but her voice was gentler. "I came for her. I came to make her pay." And then Sophie played her final card. She opened her backpack again and pulled out a medical paste. He threw it on the ground at Margaret's feet. "Leukemia," Sophie said. "I was diagnosed 6 months ago. Acute myeloid leukemia. I need an urgent bone marrow transplant or I'll die." The air completely left the room. "I looked for donors on the National Registry," Sophie continued, tears finally escaping. "No compatibility. My only chance is a close biological relative. My only chance," she looked at Emma. "It's you." Emma put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. Thomas took the medical folder, read it quickly. He was a lawyer, not a doctor, but he could understand the basics. And the basics were terrifying. "She's telling the truth," he muttered. "She's very sick." Sophie turned to Margaret, and now she finally let all her emotions show. Anger, the pain, fear. "You abandoned me once," she said, her voice breaking. "And now you need to decide if you're going to let me die too. Because without Emma, without my sister, I don't stand a chance." Margaret fell to her knees again, sobbing so violently that she could hardly breathe. Emma looked from Sophie to Margaret and then to Thomas, completely lost. What do I do?" she asked, desperate. "What do I do?" And slowly, very slowly, Sophie began to bloom. The anger that had consumed her for so long began to subside, replaced by something different. Purpose, hope, a future that seemed possible for the first time in his life. She and Margaret began to have short conversations. Nothing deep, just little things. "Good morning. Want coffee? How are you feeling?" And although Sophie could not yet call Margaret mother, although the wound was still too deep to heal completely, she began to see Margaret not as a monster, but as a flawed person who had made a terrible mistake. 2 years later, Sophie graduated from high school. Emma was in the audience, screaming and cheering as Sophie received her diploma. Thomas was there too, with that proud smile of a father, and Margaret stood there weeping silently, allowing herself a small moment of pride for the daughter she had almost lost forever. Sophie decided to study medicine. She wanted to help children in the health system, especially those who, like her, had no one to defend them. "I want to be the person I needed when I was a kid," she said to Emma one night, and Emma, with tears in her eyes, hugged her sister and said, "You're going to be amazing." 5 years later, Sophie was in her final year of medical school. She had specialized in pediatric oncology, using her own experience to connect with sick children in ways that other doctors couldn't. She still lived with her family. Your family, because somehow over the years they've become that. Not perfect, not without scars, but family nonetheless. Margaret and Sophie have never had that movie moment where all is forgiven and they cry in each other's arms. Real life doesn't work like that. But they had something different. They had mutual respect. They had honest conversations. They had an acknowledgement that the past had happened, but that the future was still being written. On a particularly quiet evening, Sophie was in the kitchen studying when Margaret came in to make tea. "Can I make one for you too?" Margaret asked. Sophie looked up and for the first time smiled genuinely at Margaret. "Yes, thank you." They sat together at the kitchen table, drinking tea in comfortable silence. And in that silence there was healing. It does not complete, maybe never complete, but it heals nonetheless. "I saw your article in the medical journal," Margaret said softly, "about children with cancer in temporary homes. It was beautiful." Sophie nodded, surprised that Margaret knew about the article. "Thank you." Margaret hesitated, and then said the words she had been rehearsing for years. "I'm proud of you, who you have become. Despite everything, in spite of me." Sophie looked at Margaret, and for the first time allowed the woman to see forgiveness in her eyes. Not complete forgiveness, but the beginning of it. "I couldn't because of you," Sophie said honestly, "but I did it in spite of you." "That's it. That's enough." Margaret nodded, accepting the truth in those words. "Yes, it's enough." They finished their tea, and when Sophie went upstairs to her room, she passed Margaret's door and stopped. "Good evening," she said. Margaret looked at her, surprised and moved. "Good evening, Sophie." And in that small moment, in that simple exchange, there was hope. Years later, when Sophie graduated from medical school, Emma was in the front row screaming louder than everyone. Thomas stood there holding an embarrassing sign that read, "That's my daughter," and Margaret was there too. Weeping tears of joy and regret mingled. When Sophie received her diploma and looked out over the audience, she saw her family. All of it, imperfect, broken, reassembled with love and persistence, and she smiled, because Sophie was no longer the abandoned girl in the hospital. She was no longer invisible. She had become a strong, compassionate woman, determined to make a difference in the world, and in every life she saved as a doctor, in every sick child she comforted, in every family she helped, Sophie found the peace she had sought so much. She proved that stories that begin with abandonment don't have to end in tragedy. She proved that forgiveness is possible, even when the pain is deep. She proved that love can grow even in the most unlikely places. And she proved that sometimes family is not about the past we share, but about the future we build together. In the end, Sophie found her home. Not because the past has been erased, but because she has chosen to build something new, something better. And in that choice, she found not only survival, but redemption for her, to Emma, and somehow for Margaret as well. Because in the end, we all deserve a second chance to be complete. The days that followed were the hardest that family had ever faced. Emma could barely sleep. She would lie up all night, staring at the ceiling, processing the fact that her whole life had been a lie, that she had a sister, the twin sister, who had suffered while she lived in luxury and comfort, and now that sister was dying. Thomas moved into the guest room. He could barely look at Margaret. The betrayal was too deep, the lie too big. 18 years of marriage built on such a terrible secret. How to trust again? Margaret spent her days in emergency therapy, trying to process the guilt that was destroying her. But no amount of therapy could erase what she had done. No session could give Sophie back the 18 years she had lost. Sophie stayed, not because he wanted to, but because he had nowhere to go. Emma insisted. "You're my sister," she had said with that determination that Margaret had always admired in her. "And you're going to stay here." They gave Sophie the upstairs guest room, across the hall from Emma's room. The first nights were strange, tense. Sophie barely spoke. She accepted the food Emma brought her, but she ate in silence, her eyes ever watchful, like a wild animal that never learned to trust. But Emma was persistent. She knocked on Sophie's door every morning. "Good morning. I made pancakes. Do you like pancakes?" At first, Sophie just opened the door, picked up the plate and closed it again. But little by little, she began to respond. "Yes, thank you." And finally, one morning, "They are so good." Emma showed Sophie photos from when she was a child, birthdays, Christmases, summer vacation, and each photo was like a knife to Sophie, remembering everything she didn't have. But also, it was also a window into the life of the sister she never knew. "I was 7 years old here," Emma said, pointing to a photo of her smiling without her front teeth. "I fell off my bike and lost both of my front teeth on the same day." Sophie looked at the picture, and for the first time a small smile appeared on her lips. "I also lost my front teeth at the age of 7. I fought with a boy in the temporary home. He pushed me and I hit my mouth on the edge of the table." Emma looked at Sophie, and something passed between them. A connection. An understanding that despite everything, they were sisters. They shared DNA, they shared history, they shared that invisible bond that even 18 years of separation couldn't completely break. A week after the revelation, Emma had the tests. He sat down in that uncomfortable hospital chair, reached out and let the nurse draw blood. Sophie was in the waiting room, nervous, biting her nails until they bled. The results took 3 days. When the doctor called, Emma answered with trembling hands. "Perfect match," he said. "You're the ideal donor." Emma hung up and looked at Sophie, who was standing in the hallway, her eyes full of hope and fear. "I'm compatible," Emma said, and a huge smile lit up her face. "I can save you," Sophie broke down. He simply collapsed right there on the floor of the hallway, sobbing with an intensity that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Emma ran up to her and hugged her, and for the first time in 18 years, Sophie allowed herself to be hugged. He allowed himself to be vulnerable. He allowed himself to wait. Margaret watched from afar, tears streaming silently down her face. She didn't come closer. He didn't dare. That moment belonged to the daughters. She had no right to be there, but Emma looked at her over Sophie's shoulder and beckoned her to come. Margaret hesitated, but Emma insisted. "Come, Mom." And Margaret went. She knelt next to her daughters and put her arms around them. The three of them cried together, a tangle of pain, guilt, unspoken forgiveness, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something that could become healing. The surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Emma was nervous but determined. She spent her days reading everything she could about bone marrow transplantation, about the risks, about recovery. "You don't have to do that," Sophie said one night, walking into Emma's room. "I know you don't owe me anything. We grew up apart. You have no obligation." "You're my sister," Emma cut her off firmly, "and I'm not going to make the same mistake she did. I will not abandon you. Never." Sophie sat on the bed next to Emma, and they were silent for a moment. "I hated you," Sophie admitted, her voice hushed. "For years I hated you. You had everything I should have had, but it's not your fault. None of this is your fault." Emma held Sophie's hand. "And it's not your fault that she left you. You had nothing wrong. She made a terrible choice, and you paid the price." They sat there side by side, sisters finally getting to know each other. And despite it all, the pain, the anger, the lost years, there was something growing between them. Something real, something strong. On the morning of the surgery, the entire family was in the hospital. Thomas, who was still processing everything but who loved Emma deeply, held her hand before they entered the operating room. "You're the bravest person I know," he said, "and I'm very proud of you." Margaret was there too, but she kept her distance. Sophie barely looked at her. Forgiveness, if it ever came, was still a long way off. The surgery lasted 5 hours. Emma was sedated, doctors extracting bone marrow from her hip. In another room, Sophie was being prepared to receive the transplant. When they were finally done, Emma woke up in recovery, feeling dull but bearable pain. The first thing he asked was, "Sophie, is she okay?" The nurse smiled. "The transplant was successful. Now we have to wait and see if her body accepts it." The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster. Sophie had to stay in isolation while her immune system was compromised. Emma visited every day, stood outside the room with a mask, talked to Sophie through the glass. They played games. They told stories. They shared memories. Emma from birthday parties and piano lessons, Sophie from foster homes and schools that moved every year. And slowly, very slowly, Sophie began to improve. The exams began to show positive signs. Her body was accepting the marrow. The cancer cells were shrinking. 3 months after the transplant, doctors broke the news everyone had been waiting for. Sophie was in remission. She cried. Emma cried. Even Margaret, watching from afar, wept tears of relief mixed with guilt. Sophie left the hospital on a sunny autumn morning. Emma was there to pick her up, smiling, holding a bouquet of flowers. "Welcome back," Emma said. Sophie hugged her sister, and for the first time in her life, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a home. But the journey was not yet over. The emotional scar, especially between Sophie and Margaret, was still open and bleeding. One night, 2 months after Sophie left the hospital, Margaret finally mustered up the courage to talk to her. He knocked on Sophie's bedroom door, his hands shaking. "Can I come in?" Sophie was sitting on the bed reading a book. She stared at Margaret for a long moment before nodding. Margaret came in and sat in the chair by the window, keeping her distance. "I know that nothing I say will fix what I've done," Margaret began, her voice trembling. "I know you have every right to hate me, but I need you to know. I think about you every day since that night in the hospital." Sophie closed the book but said nothing. "I was young and stupid and desperate," Margaret continued, "but that's no excuse. I made the worst decision of my life. I abandoned you. I left you alone in that hospital, and that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Tears flowed freely down Margaret's face now. I tried to convince myself that you would have a better life, that some good family would adopt you. But the truth is that I was a coward. I was so afraid of not being able to take care of you two that I took the easy way out, and you paid the price." Sophie finally spoke, her voice cold. "Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up knowing that your own mother didn't want you? Knowing that she chose you to leave behind?" Margaret shook her head, sobbing. "No, I have no idea, and I regret it so much. I regret more than any words can express." Sophie was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but still full of pain. "I spent 18 years feeling invisible, like I didn't matter, as if there's something fundamentally wrong with me." "There's nothing wrong with you," Margaret said urgently. "There never was. The mistake was all mine. You were perfect. You're perfect." Sophie looked at Margaret and for the first time allowed the woman to see all the pain she carried. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted. "Not now." "Maybe never." Margaret nodded, accepting. "I understand, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to let you know that I'm sorry, and that if you give me the chance, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it." Sophie didn't answer, but she didn't ask Margaret to leave either. And in that silence there was an opening, small, frail, but an opening nonetheless. The months passed. Sophie decided to stay, not by Margaret but by Emma, by Thomas, who had become a surprisingly kind father figure despite all the drama. Sophie started working part-time in a community clinic, helping with administrative work. She had missed a lot of school time because of the treatment, but she was determined to get back on her feet. Emma helped her with her studies. They stayed up late, Sophie trying to understand calculus while Emma patiently explained for the 10th time. And slowly, very slowly, Sophie began to bloom. The anger that had consumed her for so long began to subside, replaced by something different. Purpose, hope, a future that seemed possible for the first time in his life. She and Margaret began to have short conversations. Nothing deep, just little things. "Good morning. Want coffee? How are you feeling?" And although Sophie could not yet call Margaret mother, although the wound was still too deep to heal completely, she began to see Margaret not as a monster, but as a flawed person who had made a terrible mistake. 2 years later, Sophie graduated from high school. Emma was in the audience, screaming and cheering as Sophie received her diploma. Thomas was there too, with that proud smile of a father, and Margaret stood there weeping silently, allowing herself a small moment of pride for the daughter she had almost lost forever. Sophie decided to study medicine. She wanted to help children in the health system, especially those who, like her, had no one to defend them. "I want to be the person I needed when I was a kid," she said to Emma one night, and Emma, with tears in her eyes, hugged her sister and said, "You're going to be amazing." 5 years later, Sophie was in her final year of medical school. She had specialized in pediatric oncology, using her own experience to connect with sick children in ways that other doctors couldn't. She still lived with her family. Your family, because somehow over the years they've become that. Not perfect, not without scars, but family nonetheless. Margaret and Sophie have never had that movie moment where all is forgiven and they cry in each other's arms. Real life doesn't work like that. But they had something different. They had mutual respect. They had honest conversations. They had an acknowledgement that the past had happened, but that the future was still being written. On a particularly quiet evening, Sophie was in the kitchen studying when Margaret came in to make tea. "Can I make one for you too?" Margaret asked. Sophie looked up and for the first time smiled genuinely at Margaret. "Yes, thank you." They sat together at the kitchen table, drinking tea in comfortable silence. And in that silence there was healing. It does not complete, maybe never complete, but it heals nonetheless. "I saw your article in the medical journal," Margaret said softly, "about children with cancer in temporary homes. It was beautiful." Sophie nodded, surprised that Margaret knew about the article. "Thank you." Margaret hesitated, and then said the words she had been rehearsing for years. "I'm proud of you, who you have become. Despite everything, in spite of me." Sophie looked at Margaret, and for the first time allowed the woman to see forgiveness in her eyes. Not complete forgiveness, but the beginning of it. "I couldn't because of you," Sophie said honestly. But I did it in spite of you. That's it. That's enough. Margaret nodded, accepting the truth in those words. Yes, it's enough. They finished their tea, and when Sophie went upstairs to her room, she passed Margaret's door and stopped. Good evening, she said. Margaret looked at her, surprised and moved. Good evening, Sophie. And in that small moment, in that simple exchange, there was hope. Years later, when Sophie graduated from medical school, Emma was in the front row screaming louder than everyone. Thomas stood there holding an embarrassing sign that read, "That's my daughter," and Margaret was there too. Weeping tears of joy and regret mingled. When Sophie received her diploma and looked out over the audience, she saw her family. All of it, imperfect, broken, reassembled with love and persistence, and she smiled because Sophie was no longer the abandoned girl in the hospital. She was no longer invisible. She had become a strong, compassionate woman, determined to make a difference in the world, and in every life she saved as a doctor, in every sick child she comforted, in every family she helped, Sophie found the peace she had sought so much. She proved that stories that begin with abandonment don't have to end in tragedy. She proved that forgiveness is possible, even when the pain is deep. She proved that love can grow even in the most unlikely places. And she proved that sometimes family is not about the past we share, but about the future we build together. In the end, Sophie found her home, not because the past has been erased, but because she has chosen to build something new, something better. And in that choice, she found not only survival, but redemption for her, to Emma, and somehow for Margaret as well. Because in the end, we all deserve a second chance to be complete.